Hello and welcome to tonight's edition of our year-end review. This is night one of 3 nights and this event is sponsored by Brown O'Connor Communications. You're very welcome. Tonight we're going to be focusing on Brexit. This is the issue that we have it's dropped off the radar a wee bit due to COVID, but we're going to go through some of the key issues and we're also going to talk a little bit about the impact that COVID has had on it as well. You're very, very welcome. And to go through this very fascinating topic, we have Tim Cairns, who is a commentator and former special advisor, among other things. We have Tina McKenzie, who is the chair of the Federation of Small Businesses of Northern Ireland. And also you'll be hearing the dulcet tones and views of our very own Alan Meban, otherwise known as Alan in Belfast. So you're all very welcome again. And again, let's get this kicked off. I'm going to go to you first, Tim. Just go back to the start of the year, hard to believe. We left the European Union at the end of January. What did you think of the thing? Was it a damn squib? Was it, did it really pass?
After years of build-up, David, it really was a bit of a damn squib, wasn't it? I mean, we're expecting fireworks, and I remember with the campaign, you know, Bunga Bob, the Bing Big Ben and all of that, which didn't get off the ground, and there was no live address on TV. Didn't even seem to be very much special TV programmes. And I remember flicking backwards and forwards between Sky News and other channels and not really seeing anything of any great import or anything of any great excitement. So it all really, after such a big build-up, was really very much a big letdown at the moment that it happened.
Okay, Tina, obviously business, it's been the thing that you guys have been pulling your hair out for 4 years. When the moment actually came at the end of January, what were you thinking on that Friday evening?
Well, probably a bit like what Tim says. You know, we've probably been talking about it, lobbying, worrying, negotiating for so long that I think it's one of those things that you're kind of in that position where I guess it starts to wear off. You know, it's not new anymore, and quite quickly, as we know, COVID came along to take its place and more. So that kind of threw its own challenges. But yeah, as you say, the actual day, that date came and went. But for most people living their lives out there in normal society, and indeed most businesses in Northern Ireland, they weren't that tuned into it anyway. You know, I think a lot of people still live with this idea that whatever it is, sure, I'm sure the government will fix it or somebody will fix it. They wouldn't let anything really bad happen. Sure, that's their jobs, isn't it?
So, do you think people were weary, Tina? Is that because I think I certainly felt weary anyway. At that stage, it was almost like let's just be done. Yeah. So you think in the business community, that's how you were feeling, weariness?
Especially the business groups. Yeah. You know, you've been going on and you've been working so hard on it, and you've been talking. You know, if I look at the amount of meetings we had, you know, and the amount of ministers and prime ministers and the changeover we had, people were exactly that, weary, a bit done, and also probably a bit disheartened with not actually having an impact. But remember, you know, our assembly were only back, and I think we forget that they were, you know, they were only kicking back in again then. So they had missed that whole year before, of that important year of what are we going to do, you know?
And I just want to ask, Tim, because you were actually working in the executive just as the referendum campaign was getting going. David Cameron had brought his deal back, just because you were there, and I know you were in a key economic department. I mean, were you kind of that view that, look, don't worry, this is going to remain. We don't need to worry about this. This won't happen.
Well, I mean, from my perspective, I mean, I think that, and we'll probably touch on this as we go through. I mean, it always seemed to be a mistake to go so hard on leave at that point in time, whenever the referendum was being called and the legislation was being put in place. I mean, you know, we're 5 years this week, I think, from Arlene Foster taking over as leader. I think our first decision back 2015, early 2016, was to set the DUP's course on the referendum, and at that point in time it was quite a surprise to me, I think, at that time, that she came so firmly down on the side of leave and sort of backed the MPs, because that certainly wasn't the feeling amongst everybody certainly within the MLA group. I mean, there was, you know, Simon Hamilton might have been a voice that would have been maybe moderating at that time, and certainly Jonathan Bell, he was in Derry at that time, and he would have been more of a pro-European Union voice at that time as well. But those voices, for one reason or another, were probably drowned out, and the MPs were the ones that probably won the day there. But it did strike me as quite surprising at the time as to how, because Arnie at that point in time, go back 5 years, I just remember how high she was riding at that time. She was, you know, a break from Peter Robinson, somebody who seemed a little more human, somebody who
Arlene
seemed
for
to-
First Minister, the billboards all over the place.
And the whole campaign in May was run on Arlene's candidates. So for somebody to be that high after the new leadership election and coming in as the new leader, to go so hard on leave shocked me, and I think others at the time as well. And I think we've seen how that's played out for good or for ill.
Okay, I know.
Do you think? Do you think there are any regrets that they went so hard now that things have become so? It's kind of like jelly trying to kind of stick to the wall. We're not quite sure what Brexit's going to look like, even though we're still a couple of weeks away from it. Do you think they regret that tactic?
Well, I wonder, and maybe this is what David was hinting at, if we were to go back to that point in time, sort of December 2015, January 2016, did people actually think there was going to be a leave vote? And I wonder, just in the back of Arlene's mind, and I don't know, only she can answer this, and I think she would say in hindsight, no, absolutely not. I always wanted leave, thought leave was going to happen. But in hindsight, looking back, did she think, well, ultimately it doesn't matter. Leave seems to be where about 60% of the Unionist electorate are. So going hard on leave, it's not going to cost us anything, because at the end of the day, it's not going to happen. So I don't know.
And Tina, you referenced that the Assembly had only just been back, literally. So they come back the first week of January, and 3 weeks later they have this. So interestingly, a rare moment of unity in the Assembly was actually they all united for very different reasons, we'll get into in a minute, to withhold consent for the withdrawal agreement. Having devolution back, were you a bit more optimistic about Northern Ireland's bargaining position within it, or was it a bit much? It was too far gone by that point.
Well, I guess from the business groups, we were quite surprised at the amount of access we got actually in London, and to the decision makers. And what we see now, obviously playing out, is with the Conservatives having such a majority, and they could do what they like, and they didn't need the votes of the DUP. That in some ways you might say that played out well. So we were content that we were getting to the decision makers and they were understanding our position. And we found that, so for example, if you look at the big organisations of FSB, CBI, IOD, they were all very interested in the Northern Irish arm of those organisations. So our guys in London were like, what do you mean you're getting the Prime Minister? What do you mean you're speaking to 4 ministers this week? And they couldn't believe it. So in one way, it's quite straightforward dealing with Westminster. When you're dealing with people, it's quite black and white. It's straightforward enough. You actually know where you stand most of the time, as much as you can, with politicians. When the executive came back, I don't know. I think that it's sometimes more challenging for our executive, because we've been appealing to all of the parties, and we've met with them all several times, and the ministers, and we're trying to get them to think more on a macro scale, trying to get them, even though everything's looking so bleak, trying to get them to be really ambitious. We set out a paper about creating this enhanced economic zone about 3-4 years ago, which everybody laughed at and thought we were crazy, because inside there was the Freeport and everything else. Now it was their idea, which is great, because we just want it. But it was a whole paper of things that we could do for this place, whether you're a unionist, nationalist, whatever you are, that could create a better economy and better prospects for people here. And we just found that when we engaged with them, they could only just about deal with the day-to-day, and maybe that's because of COVID coming in as well. Really, they were down in the detail, down in the reeds, dealing with that, and we couldn't bring them up to say, why don't we go and demand this? Why don't we put this on a plate? Why don't you all get behind this idea? We really struggled to get them to feel that ambition, but maybe we were too ambitious ourselves in that,
I just want to ask you a wee bit about it, because, it's weird that how, heads of business organisations were quite often never off the media, on Talkback, on The View, View from Stormont. I mean, and quite often, like, you would see business leaders over here go head to head with Brexiteer MPs who were just going, don't worry about it, it'll be fine, WTO is grand, you'll be great. Yeah. What did you think of that? Because that obviously raises not only your profile, but with that comes more scrutiny and more kind of, it's a very polarised debate.
We want to get back to a place where we're not front and face of the media, and that's not because we're uncomfortable with it, but there's been so much going on for the economy, for the business community. There's so much coming up that really it'll be a good sign, David, when people like me aren't on TV, because it hopefully will mean that we've got back to some sort of normality and that we've got back to some sort of, at least we can forward plan some things. You know, people in Northern Ireland, we don't hold back. We aren't humble when we talk to ministers in England. You know, when I was in number 10 quite a few times, got lost a couple of times and couldn't believe they let me walk around the place on my own, being from Andy Town and all. But, you know, all of that was a bit of a revelation. And, you know, I spoke directly to Boris Johnson, Theresa May. You know, they were all very open. And, you know, I think most of the business organisations, you know, it doesn't bother us what their job is, because we're simply there to ensure that the business gets a good voicing and that they understand we're there to help them, not actually do something that's going to hurt the economy, which ultimately in the long run is going to hurt them anyway.
Yeah. Tim, obviously going back to that assembly moment, the rare moment of unity, obviously again for very different reasons. What did you make of, first off, the DUP are no longer balance of power in Westminster, but then they're all of a sudden leading the government back here. What did you make of their positioning, as well as some of the other parties?
Well, I think, you know, for the DUP, you know, history's going to have to judge what they did with their power when they held the balance of power at Westminster. Did they press the advantage? And I think, you know, history's going to judge that, and we're going to look back on that and see did they press the advantage at that time? And I don't know. I don't think history's going to judge that terribly kindly. But then obviously whenever the Assembly came back at the start of the year, I mean, there was obviously unity against you know, the withdrawal agreement for very different reasons, as you say. But I think from a unionist perspective on that, you know, I think that there's certainly, if there's not remorse in terms of the DUP looking back as to how they spent their couple of years when they were the balance of power, I mean, there probably should be. I think there's going to have to be, you know, pretty firm thinking about how they performed at that time, and did they really press the advantage that they had at that time. And I think looking back, I wonder, are they going to regret the trust that they put in Boris? Because obviously he came to the DUP conference and it was been the backstop and flags waving, hooting and hollering.
But the interesting thing about that conference, as he spoke towards the end of the speech, the applause got less and less and less and less.
Well, it was a poor speech, and I'm not sure I would read too much into that. I know, you know, I'm sure we're here to parse these things, but actually I just think it was just a bad speech, and I think it was one of those ones where the room was up. You know, this guy, big beast of British politics, is here, and then everybody was going, well, this is actually really quite dull. He said, been the backstop quite badly, stuttered over it quite a few times, and read his speech really badly. And I think maybe the air went out of the room as people were kind of thinking, well, maybe this guy's not just quite the real deal that we thought he was going to be. So I think it was more really that rather than the air going out of the room as to what he was saying. So, but
it was a really poor speech. I mean,
it was.
I mean, David and I would have got the copy from his special advisor, who came across with him, and it was clear that it had been written on his phone with no punctuation. It was like A.A. Cummings had written a speech, you know, because there was absolutely no capitalisation, no punctuation. There was a very terrible joke in it that they got to one point, because the press room, we were all waiting for this. He was about to say something quite embarrassing about the DUP, and he looked up and he clearly realised, oh, I'm in front of them. It's not actually, they're not going to see this as funny. And he fluffed that bit and went on, and we all kind of went, oh, there goes the soundbite.
Well, yeah.
But so he wasn't really prepared.
No,
it was as if he just came to the
obvious he
ground.
wasn't prepared. And I think he was trying to go on his reputation, his personality. And I think that the conference faithful were expecting more.
And they had Philip Hammond the night before. It's like the DUP were like the, you know, this was the Tory Conservative Party was descending into civil war. It was like the DUP were like kind of the child stuck in the middle, as, you know, the two parents fought over the kingmakers. Tina, just on the executive being back, I know we've talked a wee bit about this already, but just in terms of, have you seen an attempt to get a more unified position on Brexit? Because remember, the 2016, I hate to jump back 4 more years, but the joint letter between Martin McGuinness and Arlene Foster.
Significant.
You know, are you seeing maybe a pitch back toward that with Michelle O'Neill and Arlene Foster? Or?
Do you know what's really interesting? You know, away from the cameras and you go and you sit down and talk to these people, and you can have, you know, very good conversations, reasonable, logical, you know, makes sense, they listen, they understand, you know, and I'm talking about all the party leaders. And then you watch other things televised and snippets here and there and some of the body language, And you think, is that the same people? You know, I hosted Arlene at a women's lunch and hosted Michelle at a women's lunch. It's not so often you see them out of there.
Yeah.
And these were business women that came around the table. And with both of them, you know, were very different in the lunch. But I'd say we got to know them a little bit better as women. And that's not something they open up to that often.
Sure.
So I think the relationship was clearly building. I think then obviously circumstances happened through the summer and various other things. And I think each of them are under significant pressure individually with their parties, with everything that's going on. And remember, personally, you don't know what's going on in their personal lives around COVID and their families. And, you know, you can pick up that, you know, they're also having to deal with a lot of that. So I think definitely, of course, we're always going to say it could be better. But I guess, what do we expect? You know, I sometimes think we're nearly grateful that they can come together, sometimes work together for us, bearing in mind the places they have come from.
Yeah.
You know?
Absolutely.
Well, they're not the Chuckle sisters anyway.
Well, they're not,
No.
but I wanted to go, because I thought an interesting thing with Brexit, Arlene becomes First Minister. One of the first major things she agrees to do, she, on Brexit night, goes down to Dublin and appears on the Late Late Show, which is, for any, it's seemingly, I don't want to get into too much trouble online here, but it seems to be a lot of people don't actually appreciate or know what the Late Late Show is. So it is one of the main programmes on RTE every Friday night. It does the other things.
I think what David is, you're saying I didn't know
You
what it
didn't
was.
know.
Well, I've watched it since Gay Byrne was on it.
And he left in 1999.
And it went downhill from there.
So in 2020, Arlene goes down, and one of her first acts as First Minister, she goes and appears on the Late Late Show with Ryan Tubridy. As Brexit, the Late Late Show went over as Brexit was happening at 11 p.m. I know you've taken a look at her performance on that. What did you make of it?
Well, First Minister, of course, second time around in the restored devolution, yeah. I mean, I think it's certainly an interesting choice for her to go down to Dublin to do that. And I think there's a couple of things struck me. When we go back to our start of our conversation, there's actually maybe more fanfare in that show than there was in British TV when the Brexit hour ticked around and they say, you know, and it said, well, there you go, the United Kingdom's left the European Union. And there's I think there was a number of questions were put to her about, well, what next? What's going to happen with Northern Ireland? And she kept on saying, well, we've got to get on with it. We've got to get on with it. We've got to get on with it. And that, she also said that to Sky News, of course, back in the October, before, it's hard to keep the timeline in your mind now, but that was October 2019. She said that to Sky News, which got her into a bit of difficulty with her base. I think I've got the timings right there. But so it was quite interesting to me that this was still the mantra that she was saying, we've got to get on with it. And what does that mean? And how are the DUP going to get on with it with this border down the Irish Sea? And I think that's going to be something that's interesting into January 2021. And so we'll have to see how Arlene was getting on with it, because COVID really kind of put that in the back burner, and we didn't have to see the DUP's plan of how we're going to get on with it. Everything was very quiet until the last month or 6 weeks. So we're going to have to see what planning they've been doing behind the scenes, which is going to help unionists to understand how we get over it, if indeed it is going to be a problem.
Do you think she did a good job of representing unionism to a southern audience?
Look, you know, the one thing about Arlene Foss, you'd say, is, and I think this encapsulates a lot of what Tina was saying, like, Arlene is very personable. She's a really nice person to chat to. She's great conversation. She's great crack. And she is a genuinely nice person who, you know, is great to have a conversation with. And you could see her personality coming across in that show. She does very well, I think, when she lets her personality shine. The difficulty is when she gets under pressure, she reverts into a much more angry mode. And I think whenever she's on television programmes here, as in Northern Ireland television programmes, she tends to have her guard up a little bit more and tends to have that sort of prickly Arlene. But, you know, down south, I think, you know, she was probably realising not many people, or certainly not many unionists, watched the Late Late Show. I certainly didn't tune in on the evening that it was on. I
won't ask you what you were watching instead.
Oh, I don't know, but I believe all you folks, you watch something with toys or something. People like running around remote control cars or something.
Well,
That's the
You're probably
Late Late
watching Gogglebox or something.
something more interesting. MasterChef, the professionals.
Tina, just in terms of, because you brought up there COVID and the pressure that is bringing on leaders here. Did COVID, you know, when it hit in March, did it put Brexit on the back burner, and did we take our eyes off? Because it seems like all of a sudden from October, it's almost like, I mean, to me, maybe I've read this wrong, but like at governmental level, some people have looked up and went, oh goodness, this is coming at the end
Yeah.
of December. What do you think?
Oh, definitely. And actually, it gives some people a get out of jail card in the sense that they would say, I don't have time to talk about Brexit because we're dealing with the day-to-day, the here and now of people dying of COVID. And I can't even believe that you think Brexit's more, should be the conversation. So I also think that the departments have shown, and you might be more aware of this, Tim, from the previous jobs you've had, but the departments really showed they can only cope with so much within the civil service, and you could see that they were also in emergency modes. And to be fair, most of us that are running businesses here were also in emergency mode. We had to get our workforce out of their offices and change how we work, change the locations. So everybody went to emergency mode, but it surprised me that there wasn't more capacity, even with the NIO, more capacity to still drive forward what are we going to do here about this, and it was, we always knew the negotiations would come down to the wire. Like, there was no surprise, and there's no surprise about the theatre. I've said this to a few people and I think I'm crazy. I said it on Sky News the other day, and my husband, who's English, said, are you crazy? And I said, no, I genuinely think there'll be a deal, but they've got to make it look as bleak as possible so the Prime Minister can come out with a win. And so, like we used to do with our Good Friday Agreement, oh, I've won, and look at all the things we've won at the very last minute, not the last minute, over the deadline, 10 pizzas later, we've come out after we've really sweated. So we're very lucky in a way to actually get to the point where we've got with the Joint Committee. That was my big fear, is what's going to happen, the whole conversation around the Northern Ireland Protocol, the whole focus on the Joint Committee. What if we don't recognise goods going either way? Then the whole fear around, what if we can't actually get goods from GB over to here? What's that going to do in terms of supply chains and everything else? And it wasn't, I know nationalists and unionists love to put everything in an orange and green box. For business, it wasn't. We needed both ways to work. And a lot of people have said, oh, I heard a few people saying, oh, you were quite happy to get it agreed to go north-south, and you didn't. We were arguing always for that. We were constantly saying that the UK is our largest market. More importantly, we get a lot of our supply chain, goods and food, etc. from there. But equally, we could not afford to cut off the flow of goods north and south on the island. So we were always saying we need both ways. So I actually think with what was going on with the executive, what was going on with the British government, we're actually quite lucky to have got the Joint Committee agreement that we did.
But do you think it is a failure that actually, as a civil service and as a government, you should be able to do two things at once? Because when we don't have a pandemic, we still have lots of different government priorities going on.
For sure.
And as a business, I know you're wearing lots of hats because you own a business, but you're also representing the Federation of Small Business as well. But are you not concerned that actually we've become nearly like a negotiation issue at the last minute? And this is something that actually 1.8 million people who we should have known, all our businesses and consumers should have known what the answer was long before the 2 weeks before we actually leave at 11
Well,
o'clock
yes
on
and
the 31st.
no. When you say they should have known, to your former point, I do think that these experts that we have, these SPADs, these permsecs that we have in government, really should have been able to cope with a little bit of both. And us in business, when we're leading our businesses, because the pandemic happened, it didn't mean we could stop A, B, C, D that we normally do. We had to cope with everything. And so I was a wee bit disappointed, but I could understand that they just couldn't, because they really all were overwhelmed by COVID, and I guess that's maybe a bit understandable. But in saying that, you can't, and I'm sick of hearing it actually, especially on social media, businesses, and even from the NIO and from the British government recently, businesses need to be prepared. Prepared exactly, now this was before we got the agreement on the Joint Committee, prepared exactly for what? Because we have absolutely no idea what you want us to do on the Trusted Trader Scheme. You haven't set up the technology. We don't know what paperwork we're going to have to fill in or not, and we don't know what the agreement is going to be even for the UK. Now, I think, going back to the point you were saying about the DUP and unionism, I think a bit of a get out of jail card will be, if we get that trade deal for the United Kingdom, there is less problems of goods coming free flowing from GB to Northern Ireland. That would be an ideal for, I guess, unionism, because you're not going to feel that there's a border down the Irish Sea, even though we're still within the regulatory zone of the EU, etc. So
yeah, and Tim, you were, just to keep on the unionism point there, I know Alex Kane on another year-end review was saying about Northern Ireland being put into
The
a granny flat.
yeah.
A granny flat
Yeah.
was the term.
Yeah.
I mean, and Sammy Wilson has talked about his Britishness being diluted. Now, obviously, full disclosure here. I mean, there's no shock to the Slugger audience. I'm not a unionist, but to me, looking back,
Really?
but to me, looking back,
How the people have just logged off at this stage.
Haven't you been called, like
Fake
me,
news,
the queen
fake
of
news.
unionism?
I'll just note the green tree is beside Tim for a reason.
Glenn's Horan.
But just on this, like, you know, so for me, like, loads of people will roll their eyes and go, "We've heard all this before." But just explain a wee bit of that. I mean, is that something that you're feeling? Is that widespread within the unionist community, and is it legitimate?
I don't know is the simple answer, and it may well be. I think what happens next year is going to be critical, I think, for unionism and for Arlene Foster as well. There's going to be a lot of blame to be handed out if things go badly, and you know, if like chicken nuggets or whatever aren't coming in, you know, we're being told chilled goods are going to be a problem. And I think if prices rise in the supermarket, I think that's going to be a problem. I think, you know, what grinds people's gears are going to be things like that. You know, I was reading today, and it's not just for Northern Ireland, but the average shopping, the average cost of shopping in the supermarket next year for the average British family is going to go up £350. They say. Well, I don't know if that's true or not true, but you know, a significant increase in your shopping like that, I think is something that someone's going to take the blame for. I do think we need to see how this plays out. As Tina says, if there's a deal and in some way it makes this border down the Irish Sea, if it makes it less visible, the less visible that border is, the less blame there's going to be for the DUP. The more visible that border is, the more blame there's going to be for the DUP. So I think we need to see how that plays out. So I think it's far too early to say that we're being shunted further out into the Atlantic, or we're into the granny flat of the UK, or those sorts of things. I think that sort of commentary is a little premature, but let's see what happens next year. So I'm more in the place where I'm going to reserve judgment and see what happens. And I think unfairly the DUP is going to take blame on that Irish border issue.
Why unfairly?
I think that other parties had a choice, and infrastructure could have been put between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and a minimum amount of infrastructure could have been put between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. But political parties, the SDLP and Sinn Féin, it's obvious why they opted for that particular option. But I think for political parties like the Alliance Party, why did they go for the border in the Irish Sea when there were other options? But here's the thing that's going to happen. The Alliance Party will get no recrimination.
That's what I was about to say.
for
It's
that.
not hurting the Alliance Party. Since
no
Brexit referendum,
recrimination
their
for that.
support's only gone one way.
Absolutely. They will get no recrimination on that. And that's why I say I think it's a little unfair in the DUP. But that's where the cards lie. I think for the DUP, I think they've lost control of the message a little bit. I think, the whole spat between Dodds and Empey just didn't look good for the DUP or wider unionism and that. And I don't think the UUP, if they think they're making great gains into the DUP vote by attacking the DUP in the way Lord Empey did a week or so ago, I think all that Lord Empey's succeeding in doing is moving more people straight from the DUP to the Alliance Party. I mean, I think that's really how the electoral map has shifted. People aren't going DUP, UUP alliance. They're now moving directly to the Alliance Party, and I think spats like that only serve to move people in that direction a lot more quickly. So I think for the DUP, they need to get control of the message again if they're going to mitigate any damage or potential damage that there is, and I don't see any prospect of that happening.
Yeah, I know the UUP has dropped that horrendous two borders Foster
Well,
line they had.
it didn't last for long. That really was poor, Steve Aiken, two borders Foster, and it wasn't even clever, it wasn't even witty, and it wasn't sticking. It was just making them look idiotic at the time. So I'm glad it was quickly dropped after a couple of months, because it was poor.
Tina, how is the debate? I mean, you must be, because I know you must be, again, pulling your hair out, looking at the debate. I mean, have you detected the debate shifting at all in the past year or so, like on Brexit, or is it still as polarised as it was before?
No. I actually think that most, outside of our political hierarchy, most people are pretty pragmatic in Northern Ireland. And one thing that's really going to hit them outside of, is there chicken nuggets available, or is your groceries 10% higher, or whatever, well, that would be really high, 2% higher for the year. the unemployment level is where it's going to really hit. And I think you've probably seen today the unemployment numbers came out for the United Kingdom. And I've said all along that we have this lag in the numbers. And actually it's the same in the lag in the businesses that are closing down as well. You will feel the full impact of what we've done over these 6 months around the decisions we've made around the economy. You're going to feel that in Q1 of next year, probably February, March time. That's when most businesses are going to close up, that would close up, but also that the general family out there will feel someone that is unemployed, and when they go to look for a job, well, the labour market has definitely changed. And I think if I'm allowed to just touch on the politics a wee bit,
we insist upon it here.
Just a tiny bit. I think, if I may, I think where unionism really kind of is out of step is the fact that as soon as certain parties pushed for Brexit, they lost all of those people that are in Northern Ireland. I call them, let's say, middle ground, economic people that would have said we're better part of the United Kingdom economically, and we're very comfortable with the union in that part. But as soon as you said, okay, but now we're going to pull the rug out from Europe point of view, they went, oh no, we need to be part of Europe because of the bigger market, everything else. And I think that shifted people more than what people think.
Right, yeah,
because I think as we move on in Northern Ireland, I know our politics is very visibly green and orange. I think the shift we're seeing to the middle, and it's growing middle, is less about, unionists saying, UUP saying this about the DUP or whatever. I think it's more about the generations moving around thinking, do you know what? What colour is up there is less important than who's paying my bills at the end of the week and if I've got a house to rent or whatever. I just think people are a lot more aware of the importance of, they've got jobs. Now, I remember back 30, 40 years ago, the unemployment was sky high. A lot of people had nothing to lose. Now they have jobs. They want their children to do better. They bought houses. They want to, they're not so keen to give all that up just for an argument of green and orange, And again, maybe I'm over optimistic on that, but
Tim, this is the thing. I mean, I know you sat in election studios with me, like scratching your head in 2019 about, because the new phenomenon is people who went straight from the DUP to the Alliance Party, and we have never. I cannot recall an election where that's happened before. Just reinforcing Tina's point.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, of course, unionist parties are never outflanked to their left. I mean, and I think that's why the Ulster Unionist Party always tried to shift itself to the right of the DUP. I think mistakenly, and I think we're seeing just how big a mistake that's been. But I think just in terms of unionism and the messaging in and around the economy, I wonder how you're going to disentangle the economy and the effect on the economy of COVID and Brexit. And I think in many ways that mixing of that message probably maybe saves the Tories, maybe saves the DUP if the economy would have been worse than the rest of Europe because of Brexit. I think everybody's economy is going to be bad, and you're not going to be able to disentangle those two issues. And I think from that perspective, sort of the job losses are probably going to be sucked up in that sort of COVID mess that we're going to have to deal with over another 10, 15, 20 years in terms of trying to get the economy back. So I think that probably confuses that a little and probably deflects away from Brexit.
But I wonder if you'd still have the executive up and running if we hadn't have had COVID. I do think so. I do think you would, because I think, if you come back to the Story funeral, and I think that was a seminal moment for the DUP. The DUP said at that time, they are not walking away. So the only party who's going to walk away now is Sinn Féin, and I don't think Sinn Féin would have walked away after a year. So I think we still would have the executive today, with or without COVID. I know, I'm talking about the other parties, Tim. SDLP, UUP Alliance, very, not giving time on minutes of meetings, not giving, but this is what they say, not giving information, whatever. If they'd have walked away, the interesting thing for me in Northern Ireland is if the unemployment goes so high, and let's hope to God it doesn't, but if the unemployment goes so high, businesses really get impacted in Q1, Q2 of this. And if there's another strain of this, which is what we're seeing coming along, and if those other three parties had a step back, well, the only people you can blame are the DUP and Sinn Féin, those kind of senior parties. So surely they would get...
I don't think there's any boost for the SDLP and the UUP in that. I mean, I think opposition we've seen is no time. I think actually the only party walking away other than the DUP and Sinn Féin that matters actually is the Alliance Party, and because they hold the Justice Ministry, that creates a problem and a crisis for the DUP and Sinn Féin to try and agree a Justice Minister between themselves. But the also Unionist Party and SDLP walking away, that's not about the hill of being.
But Justice goes into the hunt next time, so don't forget that's kind of. And I know we've been pillaring the Ulster Unionist Party here, but Mike Nesbitt in 2016 did actually warn about this very scenario for unionism. I remember standing at press conferences when he said, this is a ticking time bomb for the union here, and this is.
And poor Mike, got vilified by his own party, which they do say the UUP
most went
often,
for Brexit,
where you've got a liberal kind of forward-thinking person, they often don't settle well with that. I think strategically, you've heard Peter Robinson say it, and you've heard Alex Kane say it, although Alex never optimistic about anything, let's face it. But really, the question really is, how do unionists come out of that bubble and convince everyone else? And I'm not talking about extreme Republicans, as in they can never be convinced. How do they even have a conversation with people around what Northern Ireland, should look like in the future? As part of Ireland, as part of the United Kingdom, is outward looking, forward thinking. I don't know. I just feel like a lot of that outreach has gone in the last couple of years.
I just want to ask you, because you made a foray into politics on that very message.
Well, the Unionist Party?
No, on that very message. I just wonder, so are you taking...
But you almost made the foray into, because it all crumbled about 2 days before.
Certainly did. And it's not so unfortunate for Northern Ireland, because we would have been out of this kind of crazy politics.
But are you taking...
Well, maybe we'll tell us tonight what happened, the inside story.
Listen, I'm sure most, if you were in the DUP, I think most people knew what happened. There's a book in there somewhere, maybe Sam McBride will write it.
Don't get many ideas.
No,
are you taking heart from the fact that, for example, we're looking at the United Community designation? It is not inconceivable that at the next Assembly election, if you add in Alliance, People for Profit, Greens, they could come in around 16 to 20 seats, which would be unprecedented. This
is the thing I think you really do underestimate. Again, I could be being too much of an optimist, but I really think you underestimate the fact that I think people in Northern Ireland, especially, COVID has been horrible, but it's brought us together. No matter who you are, what your family are, whatever your politics, we've all been affected in a similar fashion. Those types of things hitting us are actually things that bring us together as a community. Look at the lovely things that have happened with the Northern Irish people out supporting each other and, supporting the NHS, etc., etc. So I do think that people here are tied, and I know we always say it, but I do think you will see more people go for the middle ground, and I think that the DUP and Sinn Féin know that, because actually I think if you look at it, they are showing a little bit more outreach. Arlene going to Dublin, Michelle actually, Michelle's making efforts within the United Kingdom. I actually think that they're making steps forward, because they realise the most important thing to the people in this place is, first of all, identity is very important, respect is very important, and you get people's people's nerves if they lose that essentially. However, it's about education, our education system. Seriously, we've got major work to do on that. Our health service before COVID was seriously failing, not because of the wonderful staff, but because of the lack of planning, the lack of reform, and the list goes on. The list for Northern Ireland government of underperformance is actually huge. Yeah. And so the people in this place really, essentially, I think, will only put up with so much. And it's not the days of stick on, what did they used to say about anyone that's stuck on any sort of suit, as long as they had a DUP or a Sinn Féin sticker, they get into government. I think people in Northern Ireland are a bit past that and really just want to do the best, respect their neighbours. Most people, want to say, I would never think to disregard anybody's identity or nationality. And I wouldn't think anybody would do it to me, and that's the whole thing about, that's what we were trying to do at NI21, and maybe forget the kind of, some of the drama went on, but maybe we were too early, David. That's the point. We were maybe way too early.
I think the boat's gone. So I think that Liberal, I think NI21 were on to something in 2013, 2014 at that point in time, but I think the mess that was, I think the ship for that is sailed, and I think the Alliance Party have seized that control, and I think the Ulster Unionist Party have been in this spin of trying to move to the right of the DUP, and I think the big problem for the Ulster Unionist Party is when they try to differentiate themselves from the DUP. So the Ulster Unionist Party say we're different from the DUP in legacy. you'd practically need a PhD in conflict studies to understand the nuances of that difference. I mean, I read a statement that came out from Doug Beattie last week, and I understand that, great, but 2 or 3 pages he took to tell us what was the difference between him and the DUP. Doug needs to get that down to a sentence, to a line, and he can't, because the difference is so nuanced. It's a cigarette paper between the two positions, and that's the difficulty. You're not going to win hearts and minds with that, and so I think the Ulster Unionist Party then abandoned that kind of liberal ground. Now, Mike tried his best after the NI-21 experiment to try and regain that, but it was gone. And I think the party suits in the Ulster Unionist Party, as you've identified, going back decades, do not like it when the leader goes liberal, and they pull back from that. And then I think Robin Swan was left with the legacy of that, trying to position the UUP somewhere, but they were gone.
Robin Swan's done very well.
This is the thing,
Hasn't he?
Yeah, this is...
In terms of, if you
But
look
he's
at...
not the leader.
No, he's not the leader, but if you look at politicians in Northern Ireland that are trusted and respected...
But I don't think he would have done as well if he hadn't have been leader. So he picked up his stripes and his hard knocks and his bruises. I mean, you were down in Macrofell with me, David, and he was cutting a very, very sad figure.
Half the Ulster Unionist votes have gone to Alliance.
I know. Well, I got in an awful lot of trouble for having to go at him on the TV that day. I know. I feel bad about it.
You take the boy out of the DUP.
I know. It was in the angry mode maybe, but I think you saw him with he was very dejected that day, but I think he cut his stripes, and I think that we're seeing that now. We see that he knows the landscape. He knows how to be confident. He knows how to go and sell a message. And I think if he hadn't been leader, I don't think he would have performed as well. But he has obviously performed very well. I think the only criticism of Robin Swan that I would give is
Be careful now. Well, I'd criticise him.
That's all right. I mean, I'm happy to criticise him and stand over it, but I think the only criticism of him I would make is there's times when political decisions need to be made, and Robin Swan just took the line from the officials and in his department and just went with that line when he needed to probably politically nuance that. And I think at those moments of nuance, I don't think Robin was quite as strong as he could or he should have been. But on the whole, I think he's done well. But look, I think all of our ministers have had good moments and bad moments through the pandemic. It's not just there's nobody who's been spectacularly
poor. It's
poor.
not an easy job, is it?
No, it's not.
It's really not, and it's easy to criticise them. It's easy to kind of look back and you'll put them all in boxes or whatever. But really, you don't get any thanks for being in politics.
No,
and what do
don't.
they say? Don't they say that politics, your career always ends in failure?
Yeah.
I mean, you're probably 2 good examples of that. Thank God I have a business career.
I'm not sure I had a strictly political career. I've never put my back on a lamppost. So.
At least he doesn't think it was defamatory, so you're okay. You got away with that. I've got a question for Tim, though, because you've kind of deconstructed the unionist problem, which is that the UUP will always take the open goal and score one on their own net, where they should be taking advantage of somebody else, and it's hard to see the difference. And you do have a DUP background, but I mean, what advice do you offer to Steve Aiken, who is their leader, to actually try and differentiate and not become this kind of weak force in the middle that people are overstepping?
I think that's a tough one.
He may not listen to your answer, but
I don't know if the opportunity has gone. Maybe for the Ulster Unionist Party, I think they're going to have to do something radical and a radical rebrand. And I think they've got to break from their traditional past. And I think it's a complete rebrand is made. I mean, David, you're like a nerdy Canadian reference, but the way Stephen Harper rebranded the Conservatives in Canada, I think that's what in terms of these issues that people want to talk about, these issues that people want to spill their guts about. You got to say we can't do that.
But is the problem not, Tim? The DUP have just taken their clothes on every front. The DUP moved to the centre of unionism.
The DUP did not take the Ulster Unionist Party's clothes. The Ulster Unionist Party took their clothes off and handed them to the DUP.
Wasn't it that they just left the DUP and joined the DUP?
This is the thing. I mean, how many former Ulster Unionists are now sitting running the DUP today? I mean, the DUP. Last I checked, last I checked, the DUP are taking around 63% of the unionist votes. So for all the talk about, well, the DUP don't really speak for unionism, well, on 63%, that's a decent bit. So just before move on, what do you think about, is there even any kind of way, apart from rebranding, because they've gone through numerous different logos, what else? Like, is there one or two policies, do you think, that aren't being reported that could gain traction within unionism?
Oh, that's a great question, David. It really is. I think, you know, if you go back to the early 2000s when the DUP were rebranding at that time, and it was kind of the time for a fair deal. That was the thing we tried to resonate on at that point in time, and I think it was about looking at policies that went beyond your base, but didn't go so far beyond your base that spooked the people who were in your party. So the DUP went after things at that time like the 11 plus, like water rates, like household bills, free bus passes for the over 65s and over 60s as it eventually became. So those were issues that were really where the Ulster Unionist base was at, and that really appealed to that Ulster Unionist base and really was showing the Ulster Unionist voters that the DUP were a party who could be trusted on issues that mattered to them. So I think for the Ulster Unionist Party, I think they've got to look at alliance. They've got to say that's the people who jumped from the DUP and catapulted over us. So what can we say to those people who to get them back to us? And I think you've got going back to Stephen Harper, you know, not talking about marriage, not talking about abortion, not talking about, you know, keeping it quiet.
Or not saying you're on the wrong side of history and then abstaining on it.
That's right. Yeah. And so it's all of those sorts of things of trying to you know, of quell where your instincts are at to show the people beyond you that you are something different and you offer something that can be appealing to them.
Yeah, see, Tina, this is all the stuff that you're missing. You could be talking about
Oh,
positioning.
listen, I could talk about it all day long too. The only thing I think, the advice I would give Steve Aiken and the UUP, if they were to listen, I actually think if they hold firm, the biggest thing that can happen to them is a huge mistake with the DUP. Mm-hmm. You know, for whatever they may want to do and reaching out here, reaching out there, whatever. I mean, their greatest opportunity is a mistake or something happening with the DUP.
Yeah.
That is the thing that'll swing it back. If you look at how it swung before, that would be my feeling. But again, it's missing the whole argument of we're talking on a level here, when really everybody's missing the shifting, I guess, sense of the population, the bigger percentage of people that aren't voting for any of them, or aren't voting for Sinn Féin or the SDLP anymore. It's the people that are done and dusted with this, and the new generations coming up that don't have the history on their shoulder and all that unconscious bias, and they're saying, what? We want to hear what your actual economic strategies are. They're not frightened of the Republic of Ireland. They're not frightened of saying they're part of the United Kingdom. They're more interested in the day-to-day and what's going to happen in their lives, you know?
Although it's interesting that, you know, if that's the case and there is this sort of, you know, quiet majority, then why are the Conservative Party, Labour Party, Liberal Democrats or the Southern parties, why aren't they wiping the board?
The Conservative Party? Oh, you mean here?
Yeah, here.
Oh, yeah.
So why are they not? Why are they wiping the board? Why are they minuscule? You know, a handful of people are Conservative voters. You know, well, Labour won't even stand here. But we're not seeing that there's this great swathe of movement in that way. So I think it's not just quite that people are finished with the political parties here and are moving on and don't care anymore.
Yeah.
I think that there is a problem, particularly for the Ulster Unionist Party and where they're pitching their messaging at the minute. And I think they need to pitch their messaging to their left as opposed to the right. They're still obsessed that some glorious day is going to come and they're going to take, you know, you say 65% of the unions, but they're going to take 30 or 40% of that back.
63, don't be over
okay, 63%. They're going to take 30 or 40% of that back and they're going to be the kings of unionism again. That's completely the wrong way to think. They need to be looking to their left and saying, you know, how can we appeal to the voters who've jumped from the DUP, leapfrogged over us, and bring them back to the Ulster Unionist Party. And I think until they do that and are brave to do that, I think they're just going to be in the political wilderness. But I do think that unionism has a problem because, you know, this is not just the Ulster Unionist Party's problem. This is the DUP's problem. Why are people going from the DUP to the Alliance Party? That was unthinkable 5 or 6 years ago. So the DUP is a messaging problem, and I think it's the same things that I've just said about the Ulster Unionist Party. You've got to start talking about the right things and stop talking about the wrong things. I think for the DUP, you know, when they actually say they're going to discipline someone, like following through on that might be a start. I think people look at that and don't see that very positively.
And we did see at the general election somewhere, it's just like we're sitting in South Belfast at the minute, people who voted Emma Pengelly last time voted for Claire Hanna. Like there was a good number who went over to the SDLP. I mean, again, that would have been...
I don't know if that's apocryphal, I think.
Well, the same in North Belfast.
She went from 30 to 25% of the vote. Sure. If you look at where Claire jumped in percentage share, a bit of Emma's vote, not saying it's huge, but a bit of it had to go.
Well, I was going to say, with the move in North Belfast as well with Nigel, I mean, I think some of those moves, it surprises me that people are caught unaware, all these political experts. And that's what I think. I think there's going to be, if I were a unionist, and I don't count myself as either a unionist or a nationalist, more of a realist, but anyway, if I look at it now, I think what's really going to catch them unawares is the fact that we've got a 4-year period. I actually think a lot of the supermarkets, for example, in the south will move up to the north. I think you're going to see more things change in this part of the island, and all driven by just pragmatic business decisions. And I think people will want to stay within the European Union. I also think you might see a bit of a pushback in GB politics, and how that impacts us, who knows. But I actually think there's another wave coming. And I'm not talking about this push that everybody, a lot of people are saying on the nice sides that United Ireland's coming. Mary Lou said it's within the decade. Others think it's sooner, others think it's later. But I know a lot of unionist friends who would never have considered, ever in a million years, ever talking about being part of Ireland and Europe. From a business perspective, they can't see any other way if we don't get a trade deal. Now, if we get a trade deal and if the protocol works, not a problem. But there's a lot of people that have really second guessed what on earth's going on here.
And this leads now very nicely on to the next question. Looking ahead to 2021, Tim, obviously we will have either a deal or no deal. I agree with Tina on that. I think we will get a deal, be at the last minute, which will be a nightmare for you guys. Of course, you'll be given about 5 hours to get yourself sorted. But looking ahead, so obviously we will have some form of economic change in Northern Ireland. We just don't know which. The relationships are changed. Obviously, Northern Ireland could be more closely aligned with the European Union, maybe a little bit more barriers with the rest of the UK. How do we think that's going to maybe develop over 2021? How will that inform our political debate?
Well, I think 2021 is going to be an interesting year to see how the cards lie. What's the deal going to be? I think that's what we need to find out now. And so where's Northern Ireland going to be, and what's our place going to be, and then how that all plays out. And I think as we look into 2021, it's not just going to be Europe that's going to affect our politics. As we come out of sort of the COVID pandemic, and as we're looking to politics getting back to some sort of normality, I think 2021 is going to be the year where the DUP is going to have to deal with the Irish language. And I think that's going to be something that's going to be uncomfortable, and it's going to be interesting to see how Arlene Foster deals with that. I mean, I'd said in the View, end of year review last week, that the Executive Committee Functions Bill was my most interesting thing of the year. And
I wondered about that.
Well, I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why. But people have misunderstood what the question was. The question that we were asked was, what was the most interesting thing of the year? And obviously, all the other interesting things have been answered by other people. I was the fourth to go. But the reason that's interesting is that there's a DUP rebellion. And there's certainly about half of the DUP Assembly Party who are now prepared to rebel against the leadership. So I wonder when we get the Irish, that's going to be the real test, because that was the thing that scuppered the deal that did happen in January, that scuppered it 2 years before, was the Irish language. And the people, who were able to put their hand up to rebel in July, are those people who are going to then refuse to put their hand up in the new year when Irish language is on the floor of the Assembly. And that's something that's going to be really interesting to see. When people are used to rebelling, or when they've done it once, they'll do it twice. And I think that's why it was the most interesting thing for me outside of COVID and the Irish election and the US presidential election, because I think it gives us something to look at in 2021 when this issue comes back to the fore, once we get through the pandemic and all of that, and the normal issues start to come to the fore. Is there an undercurrent in the DUP where they are prepared to go against the leader on some of these bigger issues?
Tina, looking ahead to 2021, obviously Brexit, we've got Joe Biden will become president on January 20th. Obviously he made statements about there will be no trade agreement, if any violation of the Good Friday Agreement, which I can feel Tim's blood pressure rising already. Looking ahead to 2021, how do you think the debate will be informed via Brexit?
Via Brexit, well, I think first of all we're going to have this. I'm hoping we get some sort of extension on the implementation periods, and I know we're down to the wire. Like you, I'm still hoping for a deal, lastminute.com deal, where then, because they got the deal, they'll give us some extensions and some other detailed things. So I'm quietly being optimistic, because I genuinely can't imagine what it's going to be like without getting a deal, because I think it's just going to be chaos from the GB's market. Remember, I think Ireland is the third largest individual trading partner with Great Britain, and as I talk to my customers who are in GB and in Ireland, they have most of them just haven't even prepared anything around this, re their businesses in both countries and how they're going to work it. So, and I know the bankers got organised and they moved things around, and those who voted for Brexit, they were billionaires that moved their stuff around. The Globe are all organised, but the day-to-day businesses are not. So I'm hoping that we get the trade deal, that we can settle business down, we can get a bit of certainty, that we can get through. I mean, COVID's still going to be the biggest thing, believe it or not, over the next, I think, 6 months or so, until we can get the vaccine out to everyone. And then you see, I have to say, from my perspective, although, you know, we all love a bit of politics, you guys more than me maybe these days, but this idea of how they argue within the DUP is, you know, for 80%, 90% of our people in Northern Ireland, we don't care less if Sammy's licking an ice cream and Arlene's upset with him, or whether she's going to slap him over the knuckles or not, or what's going on within Sinn Féin between the leader and whatever, you know, whatever. And most people paint you all with the one brush, not you, sorry, paint the parties with one brush, and the executive, they call them the government.
Yeah.
And whoever, half of them don't even know who's running which department. And if it goes wrong, they'll be pointing the finger at the government and saying, why are you not helping us? Why are you not sorting this out? The unemployment's high, businesses are closing down, we haven't got access to cash the way the Republic of Ireland do, by the way, in terms of some of the Euro funds. The banks are under pressure because a lot of people haven't paid those loans back, and a lot of people will not pay those loans back. There'll be a cash problem with that. Our housing market is buoyant at the minute, so people aren't. What will happen to that housing market? How will that impact people? Yeah. So there's a lot of stuff, never mind that COVID will still be with us. There's a lot of stuff coming down the line. Okay. It's going to be a tougher year, but at least we have hope. And the hope that I would like to see is that all of us, irrespective of the spats within the DUP, Sinn Féin and the other parties, really get on the side of, God, we've got to work together to get this place sorted out. If there was ever a time we've got to do it, it's now.
Okay. And I mean, Tina, as you kind of go through all those issues, which are really quite large, I mean, there are things that kind of could bring down a government.
Yeah.
Do you think any of those are enough that actually you could create a kind of an uncertainty and an instability within the executive? I mean, with a question that kind of came in from Eugene, who was kind of watching tonight, and is kind of saying, you know, do the panellists think that the Assembly will last until the planned election in May 2022? And I suppose another way of phrasing that is there anything likely to happen next year that could actually bring the executive down? Is there, I mean, the public and businesses could be really unhappy with Brexit. They could be very unhappy with the deal. They could be very unhappy with the Department of Economy. But that wouldn't nobody would necessarily back out, would they? They would just carry on to govern in whatever good or bad way they would.
I mean, I really think that, again, as I say, they blame them all. People in Northern Ireland look up at the hill and say they aren't doing what they should be doing. You hear it on the Nolan show every morning.
But then why do we go out and vote for them again? So people say,
you always
know,
say that, but you say, I learned the lesson the hard way. You say go and vote for someone else, and then they say, well, why don't you go and stand? And it's back to that point, is what people are ready for and what people can cope with so much in terms of what's going on right now. I think at the end of the day, when our politics do a shift, it's going to be a major shift. And you won't see, for me, I don't think it'll be the arguments of DUP Sinn Féin anymore. It'll be a way bigger shift. But until then, I think the only thing that can happen is, you know, look at what happened with the previous leaders, you know, Martin McGuinness, Peter Robinson. The reasons they weren't around anymore was nothing to do with what was going on in the economy or anything. Personal reasons come along. Things happen out of the blue, and it takes us all by surprise. So I think you might see some of those things come along. But ultimately, I do think if the SDLP and the Alliance and the UUP decide they've had enough, and I wouldn't be surprised if they pulled out before we got to the elections and actually get some traction for doing so.
Okay. We have another audience question.
Even though we don't want them to.
I know, we just got it back. Well, final question of the night, and this is from Jean, who wants to ask the panel, what food items do you foresee will be the most difficult to purchase in 2021? Tim,
I've already said chicken nuggets.
Well, apart from okay.
My daughter was told that
there's
my daughter was told there's these chicken munchies that she loves in Marks and Spencer, and they're made in Glasgow. And somebody told her they're not going to be able to stock those in Marks and Spencer anymore. So I'm desperately middle class. Then we buy chicken nuggets in Marks and Spencer, but we do. So I don't know what's going to be. Look, I think everybody's fears things in around Amazon and those sorts of things. That I mean, I've maybe said in Amazon. But you know,
it supports lots of very small businesses.
Yes,
Use
yes,
it as
yes,
a-
and
as
it's
a
an opportunity for tax as well, so don't worry. You know.
absolutely. Well, so I think, you know, we're going to have to see, you know, where those things are going to come in. But I think personally, I'm really worried about, you know, some of the fresh goods that we enjoy. And lettuce, don't forget, we get 90% of our lettuces come from the EU, 85% of tomatoes come from the EU. So if you like salad, it might be a bleak year.
Okay.
Maybe you should get a bit of salad there. Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Tina, what do you think?
Don't worry about the chicken nuggets. You've got the biggest chicken production outfit, as you know, in the UK, sitting down the road in Moy Park. You'll get all the chicken nuggets you want.
I never mentioned Moy Park.
They tell you. That's another story. That's for a different day.
It's getting very hot.
Yeah.
Hey, whoa, steady.
Hey, you knocked in I-21. I won't go there though. Anyway, I think actually, just remember, you've got huge companies all over the Republic of Ireland that are free to trade in and out of here. You know, we have brilliant producers ourselves in this part of the world, and I want people to shop local. Don't worry about British sausages. We've got better ones in Northern Ireland. You know, don't worry about getting stuff in. Now, one thing, so I'm not worried. You will get as much food as you want, so don't be worried, David. All right.
Okay.
The food will still be coming, including the
That's
lettuce.
right.
Including the lettuce.
I know, I'm worried because my daughter will be gutted if Marks and Spencer
Now
get rid of
listen,
their chicken
what
nuggets.
I would more worry about in Marks and Spencer's is if we don't get this deal, they'll knock the lines down and they may even pull out of some places. But tell your daughter not to worry, because Lidl is just as good and it'll save you some money.
You said the Republic of Ireland ones are coming up, well maybe Aldi will come.
Well, they're already expanding and they're European anyway, and they save you loads of money and not as expensive as M&S.
Never let it be said our panels aren't middle class.
I know, I did
As we've just demonstrated, that brings us to the end of our night one session. I want to thank you, Tina McKenzie and Tim Cairns. Thank you so much for the chat. Thanks to Alan Meban, who not only has taken part in this conversation, he has also been streaming it. We want to thank the Accidental Theatre as well for hosting us and for being so wonderful in providing us the space. We also want to thank Brian O'Connor Communications for their support, and thank you most of all for tuning in. We'll be back tomorrow night at 7:30 with Chris Donnelly and Sarah Crichton to go through more events of 2020 and looking forward to 2021. That leaves me just to say thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you for night 2 tomorrow.